My LinkedIn tagline is, it's what I call a Menashe original, because when nobody told it to me, I came up with it myself, is if you let them talk long enough, they will tell you exactly how to sell to them.
Wow, this is so good.
But it's sometimes counterintuitive because we're so excited to tell them we believe in our product. We know we can help them, but pull the horses back.
Menashe, thank you so much for joining me on the Let's Talk Business podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a tremendous honor to be here.
So we met multiple times, and one of the things that I loved about meeting with you is, first of all, the upbeat and the positivity that you're able to not only, be in your own mood, but ultimately everybody around you gets in that mood. That's something that attracts me. I love positivity. But more importantly is when I heard that you were a traveling salesperson and you have about $1 billion of sales under your belt, I said, you know what? Everybody is in sales one way or the other. Sometimes it's because you're selling something, while others you have a company and you have to sell your vision to your team. But sometimes you have to just sell something, you have to convince your kids to behave and eat the supper, whatever it is. But we all in sales one way or the other. So we got to get you on the show. We got you on the show. So I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you again. Thank you very much for having me. I'm a follower of the show. And like you said, we've run into each other many times. I have a tremendous respect and I look up to what you do. So it's an honor to be here. And hopefully we can give people some real quality content.
Yeah,
Real actionable information.
Yeah, I know we will. So let's start like I start always, which is for the people that don't know you, a little bit of the past history, what you have done, and what brought you to what you're doing now.
Okay, I was a young boy, typical Hasidic education, went, through the school system. We didn't have an English curriculum per se, but my mom said, no, you're going to learn English, learn how to read. My first job was working in a retail store, cutting up boxes. When I had to go out to the workforce, cutting up boxes. And that's where I started interacting with people, as they say, in the real world. Eventually, I went into the retail, into the sales department, and they're going up to a management position over there. Then somebody offered me a sales position, and I was a traveling salesman. Hit the road, spent a lot of time traveling, opening up new territories, picking a place on the map. We used to do it by darts. Throw a dart at the wall and say, hey, we don't do any business there. Let's go there, put a pin in it and see what we can do of it. I like to say that I hit the ground running. I did take my lickings. I did get my, make my mistakes and boo-boos, but give credit where, credit is due. My parents didn't raise a dummy. And they taught me to learn from my lessons. One of their favorite sayings is, we learn from our mistakes. We duplicate our successes, but we really learn from our mistakes. And, it's take any mistake, and you can be a mistake and just write it off as a mistake, or you can learn from it and turn it into something positive. So I learned from young age that every opportunity we have to learn and grow, it's positive, it's forward movement. And that eventually just got into my DNA, where I'm a big believer in constant forward movement. And, I was a salesman, then I was managing a sales team. Then I had my own company for a couple of years. After the market crashed, didn't make any sense anymore. Somebody called me up and said, hey, I have a team, maybe we could use some help. And it just built on each other. And after a while, people started calling me, hey, can you give me some advice? And eventually that really just led into one company after the next company. We have a task. We want to go national or regional. And I'd come in there and do that for them. And, it just sort of bled one into the other.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I want to go back to a couple of things you mentioned. One is, and I loved how you phrased it, that you had some mistakes, but you learned from it, because we live in a world that a lot of people sugarcoat stuff. So let's say they had the failures and said, oh, we don't call it failures, we call it a learning experience. And I always say, call it a failure, but you still learn from it. So I loved how you called it, you had some mistakes, but you learn from it. So I want to go back to the part that you mentioned, that you have been in the trenches, so to speak, because you are a traveling salesperson. And now what you're doing is actually advising sales teams and ultimately working with salespeople. How much of that is of your past experience has molded you to the information and the education you give to current salespeople?
I would say it's got to be all of it, 100% of what I've done, because along the way you learn. Number one, there's always more to learn. And even as, now somebody quote, leading a sales team, I'm still reading sales books, attending sales conferences, going to sales meetings. And believe it or not, every time I went into a brand new industry, I would also at times carve out my own territory and actually go into the trenches and sell, even as the sales director or sales manager, just to see, this way, what I'm telling people is based on fact, not on theory. It's, very funny you mentioned, either you learn or earn, right?
Yeah.
I say, well, first of all, we always learn. But, one of my pet disturbances when people say, oh, it's a challenge. I'm like, no, it's not a challenge. We messed up, but now we can learn from it. Because, when you sugarcoat it, you're sort of blunting it and you don't get the opportunity to truly learn. We grow from our mistakes. That's where we grow. And, every part of it is in my DNA, as they say.
I like what you said about going, actually in the trenches and selling to understand what's going on. I remember earlier in my career, we celebrated, our 23rd birthday for PTEX Group just recently, Baruch Hashem.
Congratulations.
Thanks. And people ask me two things. First of all, people ask me sometimes, how did you figure things out? I said, first of all, I'm still figuring things out. Every day we're learning and expanding. But what I do know is that in the early years of my business, I've done every single responsibility my company has up till today. At one point, I've done myself. And I remember speaking about sales because we have salespeople. Now it's more inbound sales. At one point, we had even outbound salespeople just hitting the road. I remember it was like a year into my business, and I told my partner that we need more sales, and we chose a block that is a bunch of businesses, and we knocked on doors. And it was a couple of days that we did the same, and we got some business, we got some closed doors, we got some false promises, whatever it is. But that gave me from there on, it gave me the understanding every time my people had a challenge in sales, I knew how to address it because I wasn't speaking about theories. I spoke about how I would actually approach it. And up till today, like I said before, we constantly sell, and people think, and we'll get to this conversation, people think selling means it's a word that you don't want to use. Again, sugarcoating a word. You're selling. The question is why you're selling. Are you selling because you want to make money off it only, or you want to make money off it and also actually give value to the other person? I don't think it's nothing wrong. This is how the economy works. Everything is about transactions. So selling is a transaction. The question is only why you're doing that transaction. So I appreciate how you mentioned that even as a sales leader and a sales coach, sometimes you have to go in there and sell. So I want to get to that. I want to dive in, and I want to make this as practical as we can for salespeople listening to the show. And let's go into that detail as far as we have had many salespeople, sales coaches, sales consultants on the show throughout the years, and we have heard everybody has their shtick and their way how they coach salespeople. One of the things we heard is something that we always wrestle with is how much of a relationship does a salesperson have to build with their potential prospect, lead, client? What's your response to that?
If you don't mind, I want to take a step back and tell you a quick story. I think we can
Sure.
relate well to stories. Not everybody who can sell can lead. Not everybody who can lead can sell. Some very good sales leaders who've never sold a thing in their life, and they're just very good and they're productive. And you have great salespeople who not necessarily can lead. And a lot of times companies will make that mistake. They'll take their top salesman, turn them into a sales manager, and it's a square peg for a round hole. It just doesn't fit. But I had a gentleman that I was very close with, and he was one such sales leader who never really sold. And I actually challenged him during a break in his career. I challenged him. I said, you're not going to like me very much, but I want you to go take a job as a salesman. And he's like, what? I said, yeah, I want you to take a job as a salesman. And I told him, you got to give it 1 year, a full year. I said, you're going to hate me. You're going to be upset at me, but I'm going to coach you through it and you're going to sell. The first 2 weeks, he wanted to quit. He was like, no way, I can't do this. But after a year of doing this, he is now, he's doing tremendous back into his sales leadership role. But he always tells me the things he learned from actually being in the trenches is just priceless.
Oh, wow.
To get back to you, so this just as far as,
So now we're going to stay here because I had this whole section of the conversation that I wanted to focus on this because I think this is a place where we see a lot of calories are burned by putting the wrong people in the wrong position, and both are suffering. The person on the role is suffering, and the company is suffering because they're not getting the results they're looking for. So let's dive in. Let's dissect it a little bit, because how do you explain the difference between the two roles?
When you're selling, it's really the art of persuasion. Now, granted, like you said, we're all always selling, whether it's at home, whether it's in business. But the focus on bringing, going out there, pushing, meeting new people and things like that, while they might be skills that are transferable, I do say that great salespeople do have transferable skills to many different areas. There's the best example I could use is the 30,000-foot view versus the guy on the ground. The way I explain it in slightly longer than, don't stop me if you've heard it before, because I want to hear it again myself, is if you have two roads and you want to make a connecting road between the two of them, and it's through the woods. So you have a guy on the ground who's chopping the woods. But if he just chops without any direction, he could end up miles away, no connection whatsoever. Meet somebody at 30,000 feet guiding him. No, you're going crooked. You got to straighten out. So it's two different skill sets. You need both in any business. But there's a guy who's good at chopping the wood, and there's a guy who's good at giving the directions. It's rare and very precious when you find somebody who can do both roles. But it's a different focus of the same. Obviously, the goal is the same: increasing sales, increasing revenue, and things like that. But the responsibilities of, let's say, setting goals, holding people accountable versus the guy who's on the road bringing in that business, they're slightly different focuses. And we all know, where your focus goes, your energy flows, and it's energy. You can't focus your energy on too many different things. We see it a lot with entrepreneurs or smaller companies where they're focused everywhere and they go where they are, but they don't go anywhere further because they have this divergent focuses. And it's much better when you're focused on what you do well and what you can do. So therefore, you have somebody who's really good at leading and inspiring and coaching and holding them accountable. That's great. And that's what they should be doing. But somebody who's actually good at going out there and getting the business, that's what they should be doing. I said it is rare. It does exist. You have people who can do both, but it's slight different focuses. And therefore, when somebody's going to go to a conference, when they're going to go to learn, when they're going to try to improve on a skill, it's a different skill that they're going to be focused on from a different perspective, a different lens on the same camera.
I'll just add, sometimes you could have those sales managers or sales leaders that they may be doing sales, but they're not necessarily the highest performer.
Absolutely, 100. We all have that. And again, but they're focused on something else. So the company's not relying on them necessarily to bring this in.
Right. So I want to expand on what you just said for our listeners to take note, because I've seen this many, many times when you have great, young, energetic salespeople that come into maybe a company that had one salesperson. You know who that was? The owner of the company. And they were going on for 3-4 years. Now they want to expand. And what they're doing is bringing in this young kid, start doing sales. They're very energetic. They're very excited, but they lack leadership because that person is the salesperson, not a sales leader. And what ends up happening, I've had many, many times, and probably you had even more than that, where a person will say, I don't think I'm made for sales. And I said, guess what? After analyzing the whole situation, you are great at sales. You just didn't have the proper environment where you should actually, succeed in sales. So maybe if you just have to go to another company and they maybe has a better structured sales team where you get the guidance, the training, the oversight and everything else, and all of a sudden you're going to shine. So I think it just, for our listeners, if you're that boss or that salesperson, is take note of what we're discussing and see how could we perfect on that. And if you're the salesperson boss, how could you learn to be the leader, or ultimately maybe bring in somebody to be the leader? Because sometimes you're leaving a lot of money on the table and a lot of great talent on the table. You're just not supporting them properly.
Absolutely. You mentioned about the differences. Two things that just popped into my mind is, number one, leadership skills require conflict mitigation, people management skills. It's very, very different. And like you say, a round peg for a square hole, you're not doing anybody any favors. He could be a great salesman. I say a lot of times, boy meets girl, girl meets boy. They're both wonderful people, but they're just not meant for each other. Right? So sometimes you can have a great employee and it's not the right fit, versus you can have a great company and it's not the right fit for them. And you don't do the company any favors and you don't do the person any favors if you're keeping them in the wrong role. The skill, and this will go back into management and, leadership, is identifying what role this person will be at. I worked at a company once that had somebody who was underperforming. And through leadership, somebody said, maybe he would be good at X, Y, and Z. And they actually moved him to their IT department. And this guy shone like a star, like the brightest star in the sky. And he's still doing it today.
Yeah, so that's just another point you're mentioning, which is very much important to note. There's a famous book, Good to Great, from Jim Collins. One of the things he speaks about getting people on the bus. First, you get great people on the bus, but then figuring out which seat on the bus they have is the more important part. So sometimes we see companies letting go people. They just weren't on the right seat. And I think it's important to constantly reevaluate that. I want to go back to something I've heard you share, which is that you say that sales is not a performance or a numbers game. It's more of a skills. It's focused on the skills. What do you mean by that? And how could you avoid looking at the numbers? Because at the end of the day, sales is all about the numbers.
Yeah, I love it because we hear a lot of great lines, and there's a ton of great stuff out there. There really is. But I like to separate the concept of a line versus the nitty gritty of a line. For example, yes, sales is a numbers game, like you say. Bottom line is, if the numbers are coming in, you're a good salesman. If the numbers are not coming in, it's not working. You can be the greatest salesman, it's not working. Yes, sales is a numbers game. You have to reach a certain amount of customers. You have to make a certain amount of phone calls. You have to do those things. But these are the concepts. For example, the best example I know is I once went into a company where they said they were pushing their salespeople to make 25 phone calls a day. So I asked the CEO, it was a meeting at the CEO and the sales leader. I said, why 25 calls a day? She says, well, I have a friend who has a call center and they make 25 calls a day and they get their business. I'm like, that's great for him, but does that apply here in the furniture business? They're like, well, it should. There's a concept that I call faulty logic. It's logical, but it's faulty, right? You have to find out what works. And that's why a lot of things that I describe is I like to peel back the onion. And which is why even today, I'm a sales director, even today, I go on sales calls with people, even though they're running good, I go on sales calls. You have to peel back the onion, see what really works in this situation, with this company, with this industry, and then put it into metrics and put it into numbers. But just to say it's a numbers game, it's great. It is a numbers game, but it's also not a numbers game. And to back into what you started with as far as skills versus, I say, again, so if I make 100 phone calls, I'm going to be successful. No, it's not about doing more. Again, which also comes into not about doing more of the things that are not working. It's about doing things better. And that's where skill comes in.
So speaking about that, I want to try to play a little bit devil's advocate. So obviously we know that sometimes it is the numbers game, which means is like we all know that we don't control the outcome. We could control the input we do. The input we do in sales is what counts. And hopefully if we know our numbers, we usually hit our targets. Now, for a salesperson to hear that it's all about the skill, it's not about the numbers game, makes them lazy, which means is in a numbers game, in my mind, means how many phone calls are you doing? How many doors are you knocking? How many follow-ups are you doing? And so on and so forth. So how do you balance the two? Not to discourage a person from actually focusing on those numbers, because the numbers are important to make sure that they're actually working and putting in the input that they need.
Yeah, I like using examples. I think you figured that out by now.
Sure.
It's an example. It's a balancing act. You need the right amount of numbers, but you also need the right amount of skill. So for example, if you have somebody who's making 25 phone calls a day, he's checking the box in the CRM. It's great. This guy, his CRM is on fire. But let's look at the final numbers. There's nothing coming in. Maybe we need to make better phone calls. And what happens is when we get fixated on it's a numbers game, make a certain amount of phone calls, we lose sight of the 30,000-foot view of, wait a minute, it's not working. Now, sometimes in certain situations, it is a numbers game. Best example I use is the people who call you to extend your car warranty. We all laugh at them. We all hang up on them. Why do they do it? Guess what? Because they have success and they do find enough people. Just a numbers game, right? But for each situation, you have to figure out the right balance between numbers and skill. So if you're making the numbers and it's not working, don't just say, hey, just make more numbers. Let's find out how can we make better phone calls. Personally, I like less phone calls, more quality phone calls than more phone calls and less quality. But again, it requires seeing what's going on. And that's where leadership comes in, is really judging based on the facts, not on theory, not on logic that works, that I heard that works for somebody else and things like that.
So speaking about skills, that we started touching on it, which is, what would you say is the most important skill set of a salesperson to be successful?
To put it the best way, and people have heard me say this all the time, listening, really listening. I have an acronym that I use. I saw once. It's the acronym called WAIT. Why am I talking? right? We'll go back to the why, right? The salesperson has asked themselves, we all love talking, and salesmen by nature are out, not by nature, but their job, they make their living by talking to people, connecting with people. But they should always ask themselves, why am I talking right now? If I have a purpose to talk to, and I'm talking to something specific, I'm responding to something specific, then I should be talking. But if not, I forget who says it. He says, just close it, zip it, listen. And another thing that I always teach a lot of people is if you don't have the answer, it just means you don't, especially if you know your product, things like that. If you don't have the answer, it means you don't have enough information. So get more information. And the only way you're going to get information is by letting them talk.
Got it. Speaking about listening, I think it's one of the best weapons of successful salespeople, because if you listen to the client, you could see where they're going with the conversation, what pain points they're facing, and so on and so forth. You know how to respond.
My LinkedIn tagline is, it's what I call a Menashe original. When nobody told it to me, I came up with it myself, is if you let them talk long enough, they will tell you exactly how to sell to them.
Wow, this is so good.
But it's sometimes counterintuitive because we're so excited to tell them we believe in our product. We know we can help them, but pull the horses back. It requires training. And I once sat with a group of people. We had several meetings, one-on-one meetings, myself and another executive. And at the end, he told me, he said, you know what? I saw something very interesting. He says, you really, really listen to them. And it's something obviously I work on and I constantly work on it. It's something you have to, even at home, I have to just pull it back and tell them, just let them finish. But it's something that if you work on it long enough and you're aware of it, I say awareness is very, very important. Sometimes when you're aware of things, you avoid pitfalls, right? That's how we're wired. So be aware of it. That's why I use that acronym WAIT. Be aware that I really need to hear more, and look for the signs that you're not hearing enough. One of the signs is that you don't know you don't know, I won't say a comeback, but you don't know an answer. We all talk about active listening. I'm sure it's been spoken to death about that. Most people listen to respond versus listening to hear. And it's something that you can work on. Yes, it feels counterintuitive, but like you said, that is the key to successful salespeople, because you waste less time because you really can get down to the point. You let them tell you, they will lead you the way.
Got it. Let me ask you a question that comes up, anytime I would ask salespeople, like, do you have a question or two for one of my potential guests on the topic? This always comes up, which is sometimes a salesperson would have a great conversation, leave the conversation very motivated, only to find out that person is not picking up the phone on them again. And they can't figure it out. Like, I had such a great conversation. I was so like, they wanted my product. It sounded like they're giving me the credit card today. And all of a sudden they went, nowhere to be found. What is that? Like, what is that? How could they so misread the room?
I won't necessarily say it's so mislead the room versus not continuing the chain. Some of the things I remind people is every conversation with a client should be a continuation of the previous conversation, right? Always leave a conversation with the next steps planned. Right? If you finish a conversation and you don't have a next step planned, it's not that the client is ghosting you. It's that you didn't set the expectations, right? When you have an opportunity, we use you put your foot in the door. If you don't bring the rest of your body in the door is going to stay closed on your foot. So, and now it's not that they misread the room. It's maybe they didn't understand the room and they have to spend more time understanding things. One of the things I do with clients, with salespeople who actually have this issue, I have them use one of these, whether it's a Zoom call or if it's not a Zoom call. If it's a Zoom call, I have them do one of these transcribing mechanisms where they transcribe it, or I have them right after the meeting sit down and write. I asked him this, he answered this. I asked him this, he answered this. And I have them compile a bunch of phone calls or a bunch of conversations or meetings, and we actually go through it word for word. What could we have done better? Where did we miss? What didn't we do? What didn't we understand? Because, one of the greatest lines, and I do this sometimes, people say I'm a little hard, and I do it to people, but I do it to myself also. When something doesn't work out, the first place I look is me. I look at myself. Now, it's not to say that I did something wrong. Maybe I did everything right. Sometimes that happens. You do everything right, and it just disappears. Like you said, we cannot control the outcomes. We can control ourselves. But the first place I look is, what can I do better? What can I do better? You can always learn from something. And it's very important, which is, we talk about accountability. It's a big issue with, sales managers and directors and employees. You have to hold yourself accountable as well. That's and if you see something happening like this, that's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to say, what could I do better? And I happen to believe that the door is never closed. I could tell you stories.
No, very powerful what you just said. And I think at one point, I remember when we used to do sales, after we lost the sale, like after we didn't get the job, so to speak, and the person gave us this, like the email that, oh, we decided to go a different route or take a different agency, whatever it is. Like a week or two later, I used to follow up, when could I have a 10-minute conversation, and only to gauge feedback. And the reason for that is sometimes you found out somebody on the family does marketing services, and we decided that we can't go to somewhere else. We have to give it to a family member. Here you're sitting in your office, beating yourself up for something that, what did I say wrong? Did I do wrong? Pricing and this and that. And it's totally out of your control. But, to be fully honest and transparent, sometimes you'll find out something that, yeah, you messed up. It's a statement you said, or a way you operate that doesn't fit with them. And maybe you have to reevaluate your systems and processes internally. So I think what we're just sharing is so important for salespeople, because the best learning, better than any type of coaching or any type of event that you could go, is learning from your own mistakes, as you mentioned before, is understanding that just don't brush it off. Just try to understand what just transpired. Try to understand what happened and become better. And I think what you just mentioned is so powerful, that first look at yourself and figuring out, is there anything I could have done differently?
Correct. By the way, it's funny you mentioned calling for feedback. I actually have my salespeople, almost every salesperson I've ever come in contact with. You did the deal or you didn't do the deal. A couple of days later, a week later, pick up the phone, call them up. What did you like most about it? What really, was the thing? And what could I do better? You always have, people talk, oh, I'm coachable. Oh, I like to hear criticism. And the minute you say, I don't like that blue on your shirt, it's like, that's it. They don't talk to you again. When there's advice out there, take it. Separate the message from the messenger. There's a whole bunch of things. But the point is, even the good stuff, what could we have done better? There's always something to learn. I use this as an example that it's like going up a down escalator. Knowledge is like going up a down escalator. The minute you stop walking, we've all done it. The minute you stop walking up, you're sliding down, even if you don't realize it. And you can take a learning opportunity, a good opportunity that happened well, and get it even better. That's a double win. If you could take an opportunity that didn't work out the way you wanted it and turn that into, I will never make that mistake. And trust me, I have made mistakes that afterwards I sit back and go, what was I thinking? I blew the deal. And I've done it. And I said, you know what? I will never make that mistake again. And that instantly became a win.
Beautiful. So let me ask you, you mentioned about some salespeople are not coachable, are coachable. Are there people that sales is not their forte? Like, this person, based on, I've worked with him for a month or two, just not made for sales.
I'll tell you like this. I don't want to contradict what we said, that we're all in sales, because we are all in sales.
Yeah. Talking about making the sales a profession.
In business, yes, there are people that are not made for sales and business. For example, people who, like you said, if you're not coachable, you can't handle a deal not going through. There's certain people who just want to flip burgers, and that's perfect for them. And it's the square peg, square hole. It's perfect for them, and they're great. They'll do sales in their own way when they get dressed for a wedding and say, hey, I look great. Wow, I'm doing so great. But the ability to sell, the ability to learn and be good at sales, I just was discussing it the other day. I know somebody who was born without the power of hearing or speaking. He's a deaf mute. And he is a great salesman. He does everything by text, WhatsApp, and email. I didn't train him. I actually tried to do some business with him. He was engaging and he was amazing.
Wow.
And he really worked to develop the skill. Keep in mind, talent versus skill. I talk about this a lot, talent versus skill. Talent is great, but the world is full of wasted talent. Talent you're born with, skill is developed. Now, if you have talent, you can develop the skills easier. But I know my very dear friend of mine was not a good sportsman. He was one of these guys with two left hands, okay? He is a great baseball player. He did not give up. And he still has two left hands, but he's a great baseball player. So skills can be developed. And that's why it goes back to sales is a skill. So yes, technically anybody can do it. However, you have to be willing and determined to put in the work. Nothing happens by itself. Without real focus and saying, I'm going to make this work, nothing happens.
Beautiful. So let's touch another topic which I hear a lot, which is the introvert versus the extrovert. I know it's a common topic in sales, and we've spoken about it with different guests on the show. I want to get your opinion. Not answering the question is sales for both, because we know that you could have phenomenal introverts in sales, you could have extroverts in sales. I want to know on the skill, what is the different skills? If people listening to this and they know if I'm an extrovert or an introvert, where are the places they need to enhance their skills to be great at what they do?
It's similar to asking, what's the secret recipe for a good goulash, right?
Hmm.
There's different spices for this. You have to know yourself. You have to work on yourself. You have to see, I'm doing this. It's not working. Where do I need to develop the skills? It's not one answer fits all. However, you make a very, very strong point. And again, it's one of my favorite topics. We also, as a society, confuse introverts and extroverts. Okay. We say a guy's quiet, he's an introvert. It could be an extrovert. Has to do with a lot more than just the word and the label. However, introverts can sell in an introverted way. Extroverts can sell in an extroverted way. It happens to be that some introverts actually have an advantage over extroverts, because extroverts also love to talk. And they're that train that comes into the train station. But we all know that with sales, it's not about the train station. Yeah, it might get you going, but it's not about flying into the train station at 1,000 miles an hour. You need to listen. And it's harder for an extrovert to pull back his horses. And an introvert by nature is a better listener. Now you have to take this, it's like saying, what's the best way to walk? Well, if you have a stronger right foot, we have to strengthen the left foot. If there's stronger left foot, you have to strengthen the right foot. Depends on the individual. But like you say, clearly, it's for both. But I believe that, one of my favorite lines is that a combination lock. If you have the number, it opens and closes every time. Let's say you don't have the number. You can smash it open with a hammer, but then it's useless. You'll get it open, but it's useless. Or you could sit there and pick it. Takes time. But if you pick it, you'll open it and close it every time. Every single one of us is wired with our own DNA. We have our own combination. We have to pick our own lock. And when we have leadership, hopefully they're patient enough or focused enough to help us do it. Now, there are ways to expedite the process. You don't have to sit there for 6 months doing it. There are ways to expedite the process, which comes into leadership and being able to identify where the areas are. But it's not saying, oh, this skill set or that skill set. It's what skill set am I missing and what skills do I need to work on?
Got it. Have you seen certain salespeople that, let's say, you followed their journey where they were not, in certain categories or industries, they weren't successful, and then they moved into different industries and they were successful, that you could pinpoint of what changed?
I'm not sure I can pinpoint what one particular item that changed, but I know somebody who's great, let's say, at customer service and was a great inbound salesperson. All the inbound calls, great. Put him on the road, put him in front of a customer, and the guy would freeze.
Hmm.
Absolutely freeze. I know a young lady, it's not so young, but a young woman who was out in the workforce, put her in front of people, a superstar. Put her on the phone, it was like, you're like, is this the same person?
Wow.
Right. So yeah, there are people who will succeed in one environment versus another environment.
The reason
Correct.
I'm asking, going back to the topic of introvert versus extrovert, because what I've seen sometimes, let's say an introvert is a slower process and they need to, develop a trust with the person. Then they open up. Obviously, it goes both ways. And sometimes categories that need that lengthier process and trust. Let's say you're gonna develop a software with the company. You need to make sure they understand my needs down the road, not just immediate sale. So sometimes if you're in the wrong category, it just doesn't fit your skill set that you have. Once you switch industries, sometimes that could also change your where you are in sales and how you're successful are.
Correct. A lot of that, I also believe, different types of people, they feel more comfortable in a certain environment. So therefore, they're more proactive in that environment.
Got
So
it.
it's not necessarily the industry, it's more about where they feel comfortable. On the other side of it, some people do better. By the way, you mentioned a very important thing, and I want to highlight it. Introverts actually have a little bit of an advantage in building trust than extroverts. A lot of people, yeah, he's all over the place, but yeah, real trust, introverts have an advantage. So everybody has to do it. You have to capitalize on that.
Got it. Let me ask you a question that's on a topic that's not so common to be spoken about, and I want to hear your take on it, which is obviously as a sales coach, one of the things that sales teams develop is their sales process. And it's something like sometimes you can see smaller companies, they just wing it. You know, salespeople just going out doing their shtick. But as you're growing a company and you want to have the kind of predictable sales from a whole team, you're creating that sales process. Now, the question I have, and this is something that I've heard salespeople wrestle with, is sometimes you would have a great potential client, but they don't want to hear about your sales process. They want to do it their way. And they basically they take you off course, so to speak. Like I have my process and I want to show you my presentation. I want to go through every slide and everything else. They don't want to, they want to move to the last page and then they really throw you off your game. What's your take for coaching a salesperson that has these issues?
Yeah. Sales process, I believe, is one of the most important things for a company to grow. When you're small, you might be able to wing it. Once you start scaling and getting bigger, it becomes more and more important. Even when you're small, if you have a good sales process, it will help you grow faster and help streamline things. Again, the one thing that we have that is irreplaceable is time. So the less time, if you have a good process, you'll actually spend less time on making a sale per se. And you'll also always never be lost. You'll know where you're holding in the, where you're holding, what's the next step. That being said, the sales process, people confuse it. Sales process is not for me to tell a client, this is my sales process. This is how you're going to do it, right? Or this is how we work. The sales process is that I use to take my clients from step one all the way through step two, step three, step four. It's a process that I follow. Now, if my process have a Zoom call, the second, after the first call, my second process schedule a Zoom call, and the client doesn't use Zoom, that's okay. I'm still going to my next stage, which is having some kind of meeting, some kind of face-to-face, some kind of something. The process is internal versus external. Now, there is an external process. I need to sign the papers. I need to get the specs. I need to get this information from you, and that's it. So you explain it to the client. This is what we need in order to help you. Remember, when you're doing, and say, hey, I want that proposal on my desk on Monday. That's great. In order for me to get you that thing, I'm going to need, I would like to make that proposal as accurate as possible. So what I would need from you is X, Y, and Z. It's not changing the process. It's, you let the client know what are the steps. The way I guess the best way to put it is what the steps that the client has to take in order to close the deal. Yes, you should be forthright with and let him know what those steps are. The process is something that you follow to bring him. It's like, you're talking about the bus, right? That's your route on the bus. Your route is going to go here, you're going to go here, you're going to go here, you're going to go here, and that's where everybody's going to get off. And along the way, you decide what you need. But you need to make sure you stop for fuel, and that's what the client's going to give you: the fuel, the bus monitor, whatever it is. That's the way
So let me ask you, just using a typical example, that let's say your sales process calls to actually present the proposal to decision makers. Okay. Why? Because you've burnt in the past. If you cannot explain your value that you bring to the table, blah, 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 it doesn't come across. And now you're speaking to a potential huge lead, and it says, no way you're going to be speaking to the decision maker. You're going to be speaking to me, and I'm the secretary, and I was tasked to get some quotes, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. How much of that, let's say this part of the sales process, we have, there's criteria of the sales process. Now, there's a reason why it was created. How much of that should a salesperson allow themselves to say, now we're deviating from our plan, and this one I'm going to show because maybe I'm going to lose the business, blah, blah, blah. Or maybe it's a time waster. If we created the process for a reason, maybe this is just not for us.
I literally just had this. I'll give you a story that just happened yesterday.
Oh, wow.
I had a gentleman who I work with, and he had a deal, and it was a very important deal for him because things are very tough. It was a big deal. And the client was being beyond impossible, literally refusing to do the things. Again, we're not talking about the process. His process was going along. The steps that they needed to take in order for him to do it right, they were refusing to buy in. literally the situation. They're refusing to buy it. But it was an important project. And we had a meeting about 3 weeks ago. And I listened to the whole thing and I said, you're not going to like what I'm going to tell you. Like, what? I said, you've shown them that you've gone beyond and above and you've accommodated everything. These are the things you need in order to make it a successful program, right? You're going to need this information in order to make it work for them. So right now, even if you deliver it, it's going to fail. No matter what you do, it's going to fail because they're not willing to do the things you need to do. I said, you need to fire this client.
Wow.
Because better don't do it than do it bad. Usually I say do it, just do it, even to do it bad. But in this situation, you're setting yourself up for failure. You're setting yourself up for tarnishing your reputation. I don't care how important this client or this deal is. Bad business is no business. I said, now, because of all the accommodation and how you've shown them and the relationship you had and how you've gone out of your way, if they appreciate that and value that, they're going to buckle down. I said, but that's not your concern. They're going to do that. You do you. This is a recipe for disaster. Fire them. It's 3 weeks ago. He had a meeting with them last week and we met this week. He told me they came back. He said he fired them. They called him back and said, no, we need you to do the project. He said, I don't want to do it. It's a recipe for disaster. They begged him. They forced him. They said, we're not going anywhere else. You must do this for us. He said, fine. Then I'm going to need X, Y, and Z from you. And you know what?
Got it.
They did it.
Wow.
Now, I'm not saying that always works out that way.
Correct.
Well, you have to stick. Not willing, yeah. Right. If we need to do a presentation with the decision makers because they have to understand the value and what it's going to do, I would need their input to make sure that, like one of the most powerful questions I tell people is at the end of everything, you say, did I address all of your concerns? Did I miss anything? Right? They're the only ones who can tell you to miss anything. And it's funny you bring up the example of the gatekeeper, because I'll just touch it one more second on that. The gatekeeper's job is to keep the principals, the decision makers, with as little excess things to do so they can focus on the important things. If this is important, then it's incumbent upon them to meet with you so you can get their feedback so you don't waste their time. So if you can explain to this gatekeeper the value of actually, yes, I know they're busy, but I need to get their input. I need to get their buy-in, or else this is a recipe for a disaster. They'll understand the value that their job as a gatekeeper is actually to get you in front of them. Beautiful. So the project goes without a hitch.
Beautiful. I want to touch on something that you mentioned earlier, and also between the lines, you mentioned it just now, which is the bluntness. Like, and that's sometimes we see coaches and consultants that are there to uplift a person, but not to give them the real truth of where they are and what they need to do next. Tell us a little bit about your style and how important is that style towards really, salespeople's success.
Leadership, and we touched on it earlier, people management is probably the most crucial part of leadership. You have to lead. It's like they say, a boss gets you to do things. A leader helps you do things, right? Yes. Now, it doesn't mean, I say this all the time, you can be nice, kind, empathetic without being weak or ineffective. And you can be tough without being a bully. People often cross those two, right? I have no problem telling a client, I once sitting with a salesperson, look, territory was setting goals for the year. And we went through it. I said, this territory, I said, your goal for next year on this territory needs to be an increase of 750%. The guy looked at me like I fell off a moon. It's like, who tells a salesperson a 750% increase? That doesn't make sense. I said, let's break it down. We looked at the amount of business going on in that area, looked at the amount of business that we're doing. And I said, we're not even on the map.
Wow.
And he actually finished the year at 500% up, where he was going to set his goal at, 50%, 60%, which is normal. Now, granted, depends on the situation, right? But you can be blunt and straightforward, and believe it or not, people actually appreciate it. When you tell it to them the way it is. I tell people, I'm not a chess player. I'm not your boss. I'm not here to stand on your neck, but I am here to tell you the way it is and then help you accomplish it.
Yeah. And sometimes people, that's exactly what they need to hear and how they need to hear it.
By the way, clients also appreciate bluntness. We tell them this is not going to work. Now it's not what you say, it's how you say it. You could be blunt and you could be kind. I have people that I've been very, very tough on. And once somebody said, when he finished the meeting and I could see it, and I felt bad. I felt bad. I could see it. He felt like I kicked him in the stomach. He said my breath was taken away. I was stunned.
Wow.
Oh, and I told him, and then, when our next meeting, and I said, I know I did that. And he said, but you know what? That was the best thing you could ever tell me. Happens to be in that situation, it saved his business.
This has been great. Time flies by so quickly when you have great conversations. Where could people find out more about you and what you do?
I'm on LinkedIn. They can always reach out to me either by phone or by email at Menashe at mfriedmanconsulting.com is my email address. I don't have a website.
What is the typical type of client, like the arrangement that you have with clients? These are companies with sales teams?
I work with either new companies who are building sales teams, companies already existing companies that have sales teams. One of my pet projects is taking a regional company, taking them national, which I've done several times in my career. And I work one-on-one with salespeople or with sales leaders. I do have training classes that I have for companies, 1, 2, or 3 day type things. And I have training that I do with sales managers to sales leaders, people management, conflict mitigation, territory, disbursement, how to gauge success, how to coach your people, how to keep them motivated. Motivation, I believe, is like a shower. You need it every day, but motivation is not going to get the job done alone.
Yeah. It's the same as like, having a company with great culture is great, but it doesn't get you far. It helps
Doesn't pay the
whatever.
bills.
Yeah, it helps you with everything else that's in place. Then a great company with a great culture.
And on the other side of that coin is you could have a company that's a terrible culture and they're making a lot of money, but we know it's doomed. We know it's doomed.
Exactly. For the links, resources mentioned in this episode, check out the show notes at www.ptexgroup.com/podcast. We will link to find Menashe on LinkedIn because I think you started posting recently some good stuff there for salespeople. Let's close with the 4 rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
Absolutely. Go for it.
Number 1, a book that changed your life.
A book, it's called How I Changed Myself from Failure to Success in Sales by a guy named Bedrich. I forget his first name. I make all my salespeople read it. It's old, but it's a great book.
Number 2, a piece of advice you got that you'll never forget.
2 ears, 1 mouth. Listen twice as much as you talk.
Number 3, anything you wish you could go back and do differently.
Oh, probably all the mistakes that I've ever made. I'd love to do again and not make the same mistakes.
And last and final question, what's still on your bucket list to achieve?
Ooh, that's still on my bucket list to achieve. I really would love to have a solid training, like a real class where I take brand new people, whether it's straight from school, college kids, things like that, put them through a 4 or 5 week class and turn them into really, really great, determined salespeople to give them a real head start on life.
As you mentioned, the talent is there. We just need to give them the skills.
Exactly.
Menashe, thank you so much for joining us. I know your time is valuable. That is why, in the name of our listeners, we'll forever be grateful for sharing some of your time with us today. It's been a blast.
Thank you very much. It's been a great honor. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Sure.